All right, let's dive into Charles Dickens, A Tale of Two Cities. You sent over some excerpts from the novel and some critical analysis. Looks like we've got a lot to discuss.
Absolutely. This should give us a really good perspective on this classic novel.
Okay, great. So I guess our goal today is to uncover those hidden historical parallels, kind of dissect Dickens's social commentary, and explore why his stories still have such power today. You know, one thing that struck me is how much Dickens' personal life seems to mirror the themes in the novel. Like, we know he was engaged in 1835, right?
Yeah.
Right in the middle of all that political turmoil in France.
Yeah, that's really interesting, isn't it? Makes you wonder if he was maybe subconsciously, drawing on anxieties about love and all the uncertainty of the time when he wrote it. Did he see himself in those characters who are trapped between what they want and what's happening in society?
That's a great question. But it wasn't just his personal life that influenced the novel, right?
Right.
We know he was really inspired by some big historical works like Thomas Carlyle's The French Revolution. Right.
And Edmund Burke's Reflections on the Revolution in France. Two completely different perspectives on the same period.
Exactly. Yeah, and you can actually see both of those perspectives making their way into A Tale of Two Cities.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. Carlyle, with that dramatic, almost poetic style, he really focused on the energy of the revolution. He was fascinated by the historical forces at play, like the feeling that everything was changing.
So Carlyle was all about that energy, that momentum. What about Burke? How did he see things?
Well, Burke, he provides a much more cautious, you could even say critical view. You know, think about how he described the attack on the Queen's chambers in Reflections.
Right.
Brutal.
Wow.
Yeah, and he meant it to be that way. To him, all that violence and chaos was a warning. Like, this is what happens when reason loses to mob rule.
And you can see both of those views, the excitement and the fear in A Tale of Two Cities, right?
Absolutely.
Dickens doesn't shy away from the horrors, but he also shows us all the injustices that caused the revolution. Yes, and it's not just about getting the historical events right. I think Dickens was also interested in how people felt during those events.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, both Carlyle and Burke, even though they had different opinions, they were masters of language. They used words to make their readers feel powerful emotions. Dickens, I think, was learning from them, learning how to create suspense, dread, even excitement in his own readers.
That's an amazing insight. It makes you think about how he's manipulating us as readers, just like crowds are manipulated by those in power.
Oh, yeah.
Which actually brings us to our next point.
Okay.
Spectacle and how it's used to control society.
Right.
That scene with the king's procession at Versailles is a great example.
Oh, for sure. That scene perfectly shows how power works through theatrics. All that pomp and ceremony, the lavish displays, it was meant to, like, overawe the people, remind them who's in charge.
Right.
But then the revolutionaries, they end up using the same kind of theatrics.
So spectacle is just a tool. Anyone in power can use it, no matter what they believe.
Exactly. And then we have the Mender of Roads character, who's just swept up in it all. First, he's drawn to the revolution, but then he's mesmerized by the king's procession. Really shows how fickle crowds can be, how easy it is to manipulate them.
And you know, Dickens actually witnessed public executions. So for him, the power of spectacle wasn't just something he wrote about, it was something he saw. He saw how people were drawn to these horrible events, almost in a trance.
It's kind of unsettling, isn't it, that fascination with violence? It makes you wonder if Dickens was trying to show us, the readers, that we're part of it too, Are we also drawn to suffering, even if we say we're against it?
It's a really interesting point. Like, he's holding a mirror up to society, making us face our own complicity. Speaking of unsettling things, what about the theme of state secrecy and surveillance? I was really struck by that detail about Roger Clive's funeral procession. A spy given a secret burial.
Well, yeah. It's one of those moments where you realize that historical fiction sometimes isn't that far from reality. Dickens was drawing on real accounts of what they called informer culture. It was a time when everyone was afraid, suspicious of each other.
Wow.
Neighbors spying on neighbors. Crazy.
Yeah, a chilling reminder of how power can work behind the scenes. Then there's Dr. Manette, unjustly imprisoned for years, and he develops that shoemaking habit as a way to cope.
His story really shows the psychological damage that state secrecy and isolation can cause. The way he clings to that simple, repetitive task says so much about the trauma he's experienced.
Yeah, and then there's that cryptic conversation about 105 North Tower.
Yeah.
So much suspense, so much left unsaid. What do you think Dickens was trying to do with that detail?
Well, I think on the surface, it's simply a reference to his prison cell. But It goes deeper than that. It symbolizes how trauma can stay with you, how secrets can haunt you even after you've escaped physical imprisonment.
So we have the public spectacle of the revolution, but then we also have these private, hidden stories of suffering. It's like Dickens is showing us both sides.
Exactly. And that contrast is really important for understanding the novel's message. He's not just telling us about the French Revolution. He's exploring what it means to be human under extreme pressure. How do people get through these times of upheaval? Where do they find comfort and strength?
And one place they find strength is in family, right?
Absolutely.
The Manette family, after everything they've been through, they're kind of an antidote to all those oppressive state forces.
Definitely. Dickens contrasts the big public spectacle with the quiet intimacy of their family life. He even directly states his philosophy about the right to privacy, highlighting how sacred individual experience is.
Yeah, it's like he's saying that love and connection are essential for people to thrive, especially in times of chaos. And speaking of connection, we can't forget about Miss Pross. She's like this rock of common sense, a force of stability in all this turmoil.
Oh, yeah. Miss Pross is great. Fiercely loyal, protective, totally devoted to the Manettes. I think she represents a certain British resilience, that steadfastness that Dickens really seemed to admire.
It's like she embodies that British keep calm and carry on attitude, even when the world is falling apart.
Exactly. Which really contrasts with that revolutionary energy of characters like Madame Defarge, who we'll talk about later. But for now, let's dive into Dickens' use of character and symbolism. Let's start with that famous opening line. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times.
That opening always gets to me. It's so simple but so powerful. It's like he's trying to make us, the readers, feel the weight of that historical moment. Do you think he was purposely trying to blur the lines between past and present, make us feel like we're right there in the revolution?
I think that's a great point. And that duality, that feeling of being stuck between extremes, it runs through the whole novel. It's not just about two cities. It's about two ways of being, two ways of experiencing the world.
And it's reflected in the title, too, right?
Yes.
London and Paris, two cities on the verge of change, mirroring each other, but also representing different parts of the human experience.
Exactly. And, he specifically sets the story in 1775. That's not random. It's loaded with meaning. Both England and France were facing a lot of tension in 1775, both on the brink of revolution.
So even in that first chapter, he's setting the stage for all the drama that's going to unfold.
Yes.
And then there's that encounter with Jerry Cruncher and the mysterious passenger in chapter 2, the mail. It's all so secretive, so suspenseful.
That's pure Dickens. Those cryptic conversations, the whispered messages. He's drawing us in, creating a mood of intrigue. He was a master at it.
And there's that line from the passenger. 18 years, said the passenger, looking at the sun. Gracious creator of day, to be buried alive for 18 years gives me chills every time.
It foreshadows so much of what's coming, doesn't it? Imprisonment, isolation, the damage that state power can inflict. He plants those seeds early on, and they keep coming back throughout the story.
It's like we're getting these little glimpses of the darkness that's ahead, hints of all the violence and trauma that's going to happen.
Exactly. It's that mastery of foreshadowing, that ability to build suspense that keeps us hooked. We know something terrible is coming, but we don't know what or when.
Like that feeling you get when you know a storm is brewing. And speaking of brewing storms, let's move on to our next topic. Wine, blood, and the imagery of revolution.
Let's do it. So, thinking about that imagery of wine and blood, it's interesting how Dickens uses it to foreshadow the violence that's coming in the revolution. Remember in Saint Antoine when the wine spills in the street?
Yeah.
It's not just a spilled drink. It's like a premonition, a stain that hints at the bloodshed that's to come.
Yeah, it's really powerful imagery. It makes you think about how something that should be joyful, like wine, meant for celebrations, can become a symbol of chaos and destruction.
Exactly. And it's not just the spilled wine. It's the whole atmosphere Dickens creates around the wine shop and the people who go there.
Right.
Poverty, hunger, this simmering resentment that's ready to explode. He's creating like a powder keg of human emotion just waiting for a spark.
And at the heart of it all are the Defarges.
Oh, absolutely.
They're not just characters, are they? They represent the revolution itself.
Yeah, for sure. The wine shop becomes like this meeting place for revolutionaries. They plot and dissent there. And then you have Madame Defarge, always with her knitting needles. She's almost like a mythical figure.
Her knitting always creeps me out.
Yeah, it's scary.
It's not just a hobby. It's like she's keeping track of death. A list of everyone the revolution will destroy.
Exactly. It's chilling, right? Because it suggests this cold, calculated ruthlessness. Each stitch is a life. It's like fate has already been decided. Makes you think about how revolutions can dehumanize people, how individuals can get lost in all the ideological fervor.
Yeah, and it connects back to that theme of fate that runs through the whole novel. Are the characters really in control? Or are they just being swept along by forces they don't understand?
That's something Dickens really grapples with throughout the story.
Mhm.
But before we get too deep into the revolution itself, I think we should look at the other side, the French aristocracy.
Right, all that extravagance.
Yeah.
The chapter Monseigneur in Town, it's almost funny how he describes the aristocracy and how lavish their lifestyle is. Remember how Monseigneur needs 4 men to help him drink his chocolate?
It's classic Dickens. He's using satire to show how ridiculous they are. They live so extravagantly, totally detached from reality. He's pointing out that huge gap between the rich and the poor, setting the stage for the conflict to come.
And then there's that scene where the Marquis's carriage runs over a child in Paris, just tosses a coin at the grieving father and drives away. Doesn't even care.
It's so callous. And it perfectly captures the aristocracy's indifference to the suffering of the common people, a stark reminder of the injustice that fuels the revolution.
Yeah, it's moments like that, those casual displays of cruelty that make the revolution seem inevitable. It's like Dickens is saying, look, this system is broken, something has to change.
And then you have that scene where the Marquis finds a stowaway clinging to the chain of his carriage. Scary and suspenseful. But it also has a deeper meaning.
Yeah, it's symbolic, like that desperate man holding on for dear life represents French society itself, just barely holding on, about to be ripped apart.
And when the revolution does erupt, Dickens doesn't hold back on the brutality. The chapter, The Sea Rises, it's a visceral account of mob violence, almost overwhelming. It reminds us that even revolutions fought for good causes can unleash this terrifying energy.
That chapter is intense. The way Dickens describes the mob's anger, their need for revenge, it's disturbing. But even in all that chaos and bloodshed, he finds moments of humanity.
Oh yeah, for sure. Like when the revolutionaries free Dr. Manette from the Bastille.
Right.
Such a powerful moment of hope amidst all the darkness.
And it speaks to that duality we were talking about, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
The revolution brings out the worst in people, but it also creates opportunities for amazing acts of courage and selflessness.
And I think Dr. Manette embodies that duality. He's a victim of the old regime, unjustly imprisoned, but he also represents hope and renewal in the early days of the revolution.
Right. He represents the possibility of transformation, the idea that even after suffering, you can come out of the darkness and start fresh. But as we know, the revolution takes a dark turn with the Reign of Terror. It's like it devours itself, turning on its own people in a wave of paranoia and suspicion.
And we see that shift in Madame Defarge.
Right.
She starts as a sympathetic character, a woman who has lost everything because of the aristocracy. But her desire for revenge consumes her, turning her into this ruthless, almost monstrous figure.
Yeah, and her knitting takes on a whole new meaning during the Reign of Terror.
Absolutely.
It becomes a symbol of the revolution's insatiable thirst for blood.
Exactly. It highlights one of the novel's most important themes, the idea that violence is cyclical. The revolution starts with these noble goals of liberty and equality, but then it quickly descends into a new kind of tyranny. It's like Dickens is warning us that power corrupts no matter who has it.
It's a pretty bleak view of human nature, but it also feels very relevant to today's world. We're still dealing with these issues: political polarization, social unrest, the misuse of power.
And it's not just the political themes that resonate. Dickens' critique of the legal system is still relevant too. Think about the trials in the novel, especially Darnay's trials. He's constantly being accused, judged, and condemned,
Right.
often based on very little evidence.
Those trials are so suspenseful. They really show how easily justice can be manipulated, how the law can be used as a weapon against innocent people.
And he criticizes both the French and English legal systems. He shows that they're both capable of hypocrisy and corruption, that the pursuit of justice can be derailed by personal agendas and politics.
So it's like he's saying that true justice is hard to find, that the legal system often serves those in power, regardless of who's in charge.
And that leads us to one of the most profound parts of the novel, its exploration of the human capacity for both good and evil. You see characters like Darnay and Carton struggling with their consciences, trying to figure out what to do in a world that's gone mad.
Yeah, it's not a simple world of good guys and bad guys. Dickens makes us confront the complexities of human nature, how we're all capable of great kindness and terrible cruelty.
And he doesn't offer easy answers. He forces us to ask, what would we do in these situations? How would we handle the pressure of revolution, the temptation of revenge, the call to sacrifice?
It's a tough but rewarding read, and it reminds us that even in the darkest times, there's always hope for redemption, but that redemption often comes at a price.
Which brings us to Sidney Carton and his ultimate act of self-sacrifice. He starts off as this cynical, self-destructive drunk. He's given up on life, resigned to being miserable.
But then he meets Lucy Manette, and everything changes.
Right.
His love for her transforms him. It gives him a purpose, a reason to believe in something bigger than himself.
And it's that love that ultimately leads him to make the ultimate sacrifice. He takes Darnay's place at the guillotine, giving his own life to save a man he barely knows.
It's such a powerful scene, really makes you think about the nature of sacrifice, the lengths we'd go to for the people we love.
And his last words, "It is a far, far better thing that I do than I have ever done. It is a far, far better rest that I go to than I have ever known," are some of the most memorable lines in literature.
They really are. They stay with you. And they show the redemptive power of love, the idea that even the most flawed people can be incredibly selfless.
Exactly. And I think Carton's sacrifice also makes us think about the revolution itself. Was his death really necessary? Could they have broken the cycle of violence in another way?
Tough questions, and I don't think Dickens gives us any easy answers. But he definitely makes us consider the cost of revolution, the human toll that's often hidden behind the grand narratives of history.
And speaking of history, it's important to remember that Dickens wrote this novel long after the French Revolution. He could look back and see the long-term effects of those events.
So he wasn't just recreating the past, he was trying to understand it, to figure out what it meant for his present and for the future.
Exactly. And that's why A Tale of Two Cities feels so timeless. It's not just a historical novel. It's a reflection on the human condition, on that constant struggle between hope and despair, between our capacity for great love and great violence.
And those struggles are just as real today as they were in Dickens' time. We're still dealing with the same questions about social justice, political power, and what revolution really means.
Absolutely. Dickens' insights into human nature, into the forces that shape history, they're more powerful and relevant than ever. Before we move on to our final thoughts and connect this all back to the present day, we'd love to hear from you. What's resonated with you so far in our look at A Tale of Two Cities? What connections have you made? Share your thoughts, and we'll be back soon for our final part.
Welcome back. We've spent quite a bit of time now with Dickens' London and revolutionary Paris and really got to know those characters. I think we've unpacked some pretty thought-provoking ideas. But where do we go from here? How does it all connect back to today's world?
I'm ready to tie it all together if you are. I think there's so much to discuss.
Me too. We've covered the historical context, Dickens' social commentary, the power of his storytelling. But I guess the question is, what's the takeaway for us? What does it all mean now?
What strikes me is how relevant A Tale of Two Cities still is. All those things that shaped revolutionary France, social inequality, political unrest, people abusing their power, we're still dealing with that stuff today.
It's kind of scary to think about. Are we just stuck repeating the same cycles of revolution and upheaval?
I don't think we're doomed, but Dickens definitely gives us a warning. His novel shows what can happen when societies become really divided, when those in power ignore the needs of the people, when the gap between the rich and poor becomes so wide it's impossible to bridge. He's reminding us that we have to be careful to protect those democratic systems we have and make sure everyone has a voice.
And it's not just about systems, right?
Right.
Dickens shows the power of individual choices, even when everything seems totally overwhelming.
Oh yeah, definitely. Like Carton's sacrifice, or think about Dr. Manette and how resilient he was after all that trauma. Those characters show us that even small acts of courage or compassion can have a ripple effect. They create positive change, even in dark times.
That's actually really hopeful, especially when we think about what's happening in the world today. It can all feel so overwhelming sometimes.
Right.
But Dickens reminds us that we all have a choice. We can make a difference.
And don't forget that Dickens himself was a reformer. He used his writing to expose injustice, to fight for the poor and the oppressed. He truly believed that stories could change the world.
So A Tale of Two Cities wasn't just a story.
Oh no, it was a call to action. It was his way of challenging readers to face the injustices of their time and work toward a better society.
And that challenge still applies to us today. We're still dealing with many of the same things Dickens wrote about: poverty, inequality, the abuse of power. He's asking us to look at our own roles in these systems, to think about what we can do to make things better.
Yeah. And I think on a personal level, A Tale of Two Cities also makes us think about our own capacity for good and evil. It's a story about the choices we make, the sacrifices we're willing to make, and the consequences.
Okay, I have a question that's been bugging me this whole time. It does involve a spoiler, though, so if you haven't read the book, maybe skip ahead a minute or two.
Okay, I'm listening.
Was Sidney Carton's sacrifice really necessary? Could he have found another way to save Darnay?
Ah, that's the big question, isn't it? Literary scholars and regular readers have debated this forever. There's no easy answer, which is part of what makes it so interesting.
Right. On one hand, it's super heroic. He gives his life to save a man he barely knows, a man who represents everything he hates about himself. It's like the ultimate act of selflessness. Love wins.
But then there's that feeling that it was inevitable, like Dickens just couldn't resist a tragic ending, which makes you think, was there really no other option?
Exactly. Some say Carton could have used his connections, his smarts, his knowledge of the legal system to find a loophole, or help Darnay escape. Dickens believed in social reform, that positive change was possible. So it seems odd that he would have such a fatalistic view of fate.
That's a good point. But I think Carton's sacrifice means more than that. It's his way of making up for his wasted life, a chance to do something really meaningful.
Yeah.
It's like he's redeeming himself, showing that even broken people can be capable of great love and self-sacrifice.
So in that sense, his sacrifice becomes a symbol of hope, proof that even in the darkest circumstances, the human spirit can triumph.
Exactly. And I think it challenges us to consider what we're willing to sacrifice for our beliefs, for the people we love. Could we be that selfless?
Those are some deep questions, the kind that stay with you. I think that's what makes Dickens so great. He wasn't just telling a story, he was asking us to really think about human nature, justice, the meaning of life.
And he did it in a way that's both entertaining and thought-provoking, combining history, social commentary, and amazing characters in a way that still speaks to readers today.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into A Tale of Two Cities, I think we're left with a few things. A sense of awe at Dickens' talent, a deeper understanding of the historical context, and a new appreciation for how literature can challenge, inspire, and move us.
Yeah, and hopefully we've given you some things to think about. Could the French Revolution have gone differently? Was Carton's sacrifice really the only option? What would you have done?
Those are questions worth pondering. And I think that's what makes great books so special. They stick with you, make you think differently about the world and your place in it.
So thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you've enjoyed it as much as we have.
And remember, this is just the start of your exploration. There's so much more to discover in Dickens' work, so many layers to unpack.
Right, so go read, reread, and let Dickens take you to that world of revolution, redemption, and the incredible strength of the human spirit.
And until next time, keep those big questions in mind. Keep diving deep.